Thank you so much for being here. And the people I want to introduce, first of all, probably need no introduction, but I've got to do it anyway. This is Frank Bongiorno. He's one of Australia's most eminent historians, a great thinker and writer, and author of Dreamers and Schemers, a study of Australian politics and leadership that we'll be talking a little bit about today. And we also have Lech Blaine, another of Australia's great writers, thinkers and commentators, who has just written this great biographical essay of Peter Dutton called Bad Cop. So, Lech, is it true that you started dreaming about Peter Dutton while you were writing this?
That was off the record.
Who doesn't, you know?
Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Darkinjung people. And we will have some questions at the end. Please no comments, no matter how enthused you are. So this session is kind of one that, I mean, I would love to hear from you, whether or not we were in a writers' festival, about what is happening at this moment in time politically. It feels like things are very fast moving. It feels like they are rancorous. How different is this time in Australian politics from the times that have preceded it?
Gosh, that sounds like a historian question, so I better have a go, I guess. Very different in some ways. I mean, clearly, as the last election showed, a lot of the, verities, I guess you'd call them, the things we kind of taken for granted about political allegiance and alignment are disintegrating before our eyes. Now, it didn't happen, all at once, but, at the last election, the last federal election, you could argue the primary vote, say for the lower house that makes and unmakes governments, split three ways. You kind of had the Labor bit, which was a bit under a third, and then you had the coalition bit that was a bit over a third, and then you had the sort of minor parties and independents. And that had sort of been heading in that direction for a while. But, to me that suggested, it indicated some really important changes, I think. The era of, I guess, the sort of rusted on voter of, the voter who at 18 or 21, as it used to be, would, sort of inherit, I guess, an allegiance and from parents. The old political sociology said fathers were particularly influential in passing on political allegiances, and then they'd kind of stick to that for their lifetime until they were carried off in a box. Is over. And I think that's, it means that any government, for instance, and perhaps oppositions too, have to keep making and remaking the kind of coalitions of electoral support to keep them in office. And it's, it's obviously having all sorts of effects on political styles, leadership, agenda. Things are, I think, quite different. I think there has been a bit of a break in the ways that we do politics.
Lech, what type of electoral coalition is Peter Dutton trying to put together to win the Prime Ministership of Australia?
And this is the really interesting thing in terms of, it didn't all happen at once, and I think that this is fed into the instability in Australian politics. A lot of people would attribute that solely to the kind of pathology of the politicians involved in those various leadership coups, and there was a fair bit of pathology involved. But I think that what was happening is that within the major parties, those electoral coalitions were kind of breaking down, and so you had the kind of what would now be seen as a teal voter was diametrically opposed to the kind of coal mining communities that the coalition held in Queensland, and they didn't really have anything in common. And once the main debate had moved on from capital to an issue like climate change, you couldn't actually bring those two voters together. And the same thing happened within the Labor Party. You had seats like Grayndler and Sydney that doesn't on an issue like climate change doesn't meet with Hunter and Patterson and Shortland. And so what I think what Dutton is doing is kind of saying, rather than going, I can put the genie back into the bottle and I can bring the teal voters back, he's going, I'm just going to go for a fairly populist message, going for outer suburban and regional Labor seats. And that's really focusing on those fault lines around identity, but also around the transition to renewable energy.
Yeah, it's striking, again, reading Bad Cop, how often the words inner city crop up as an insult. And, I mean, to some extent, the Teals are people just tiring of that insult. I mean, inner city seats have traditionally been occupied by the Liberal Party, right?
Yeah, and it's also particularly ironic given that I think, like I mentioned in the essay, that there was a point in time where Peter Dutton owned about 6 properties and none of them were in the outer suburbs. There was like a penthouse in the Brisbane CBD, a penthouse in the Canberra CBD. And so this kind of like confected hatred of the inner city is kind of ridiculous, because if you look at the history of the Liberal Party, like it was, it always had a conservative streak in it, but it was a party that encapsulated, educated constituencies within the inner city, and also women. They had an advantage over the Labor Party with women within the electorate, and that's completely flipped around.
As far as I know, no columnists for The Australian and no commentators for Sky News live in Penrith.
And their offices are in Surrey Hills, so yeah, that's right.
I'll just say quickly, because Tony Abbott, after the election, advocated that the new heartland for the Liberal Party was Penrith. The New South Wales Liberal Party subsequently lost the seat of Penrith at the state election, and I interviewed Bridget McKenzie, and she said, I cannot wait to see Tony Abbott's face on a corflute in Penrith running for the local seat there, or any of the people who were criticising her on Sky News to put up their faces on a corflute in those seats, because she represents one of the poorest electorates in Australia, and then yet she's also held up as kind of like an inner city elite. It doesn't really make any sense.
How much of this is copied from an international context to a local context where it makes a lot less sense? Australia is a much more metropolitan country than the United States or even the UK, for example. So the constituencies, even the raw number of people we're talking about here in the inner city, tends to be a much higher proportion of the population than it does in the United States, for example.
Yeah, look, even the phrase, the suburban strategy, sounds a hell of a lot like the Southern strategy, doesn't it, of the Republican Party, under Reagan and under Nixon and Reagan, really. So yeah, look, there's a whiff of the Americanism about it. Morrison was, I think, the most Americanised Prime Minister we've ever had. And I think, I tell you what, it's been all in that direction since, hasn't it? I recently had the pleasure of his memoir, which I read, and it's utterly designed for an American audience. And so, yeah, look, I think there is a strong element of an attempt to adapt, the kind of the Brexit ethic, I suppose, and the whole Trump thing to an Australian context. But, we have a very different sort of system. We have compulsory voting, for starters, which, the political science literature sort of tells us that it tends to produce this centre of people who are, they're there to be persuaded, they're not highly partisan, they don't have to be persuaded to actually go out and vote because they have to. Although, that said, we're down to about 90%, I think, in terms of, the last election, or under 90% in terms of turnout. So something is happening there, even under a compulsory system. But it just seems to me a lot of that doesn't translate well to an Australian system. And also a parliamentary system is the other aspect, where every Prime Minister, every leader of the opposition is having to manage a particular sort of complex situation within their own party in a parliamentary system that is quite different, I think, certainly from what you have in the United States, where, the appeal, if you like, over the top of the party machine makes a lot more sense. And that's effectively what Trump has done before he actually managed to capture the party machine, which is where they are now.
One of the kind of secrets of Australian politics is that we are sometimes ahead of trends instead of behind them. Labor Party neoliberalism was pioneered in Australia to a degree. The kind of anti-globalisation immigration politics, which are now everywhere in Europe and the United States, were pioneered to a degree. How much of the kind of crises of legitimacy that we see in the US and the UK are things that we have already had in our Rudd, Gillard, Turnbull, Abbott period.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that happened was that Howard, who was a master of like kind of straddling these electoral coalitions, absorbed a lot of that populist vote out of One Nation. One Nation evaporated. They've come back, but they've never really gone to the next level as a serious threat to the mainstream parties. And so that has meant that I don't like... It's funny because I think that there actually is an avenue in Australia for a large-scale populist revolt, but all of the people who have been filling that space over the past decade have been such morons that they haven't been able to actually capitalise on it.
I mean, the influence has often been very direct, haven't they? I mean, Sir Linton Crosby having, engineered coalition victories, including famously in 2001 here, but basically went over and set up shop in the United Kingdom and has been a major influence on electoral politics there. And we now have a Tory party in the UK talking about stopping the boats. That's their big slogan. Well, where have you heard that? So yeah, there've been, and there's a whole bunch of lesser lights, kind of another layer, but beneath the sort of the Linton Crosby types who have made careers, if you like, based on their Australian experience within British politics, sometimes in mayoral politics. Boris Johnson owed a great deal to Australian advice. So yeah.
When we do look at these international trends and systemic issues, how much does that reduce character as an influence in political destiny? It's easy to kind of psychoanalyze people, but when we look at something and say, okay, well, the Rwanda policy in the UK is a retooled version of the Nauru policy here, or the Pacific solution, that means that to some extent, the individual character of leaders is not the influence that it might have once been. What do you think?
Well, I think it's, as I said, in terms of pathologising some of the leaders that we've had, and yeah, like it's very easy to pathologise someone like Morrison, for example, but then you look at the way that he kind of represents the complete evaporation of the social basis for the major political parties. He's kind of like not a misnomer. He is like a product of political parties not really being able to govern the country because it's so hard to have like a majority of an electoral coalition. So if you're trying to do a large-scale policy, you're generally splitting your electoral base in half, and both parties have been struggling with that, and we're kind of like going around and around in circles. And I think one of the possible advantages of maybe a minority government is that Australia will kind of make peace with the idea that it isn't actually possible to have that majority anymore, and kind of allow the country to be governed by a coalition of interests, which is kind of obvious. Like we had minority government, but we've always had minority government whenever the Liberal and National Party have been in government together, but we don't call it minority government because it's just been there for so long. And so I don't necessarily see that as being like the end of the world if Labor was to go into minority government at the next election and actually have to be able to bring a more diverse electoral coalition together.
I mean, the character issue is interesting, because I would have thought it was character in the end that sort of got Morrison, wasn't it? I mean, Morrison struck me as a very kind of creative leader in some ways, and certainly a very entrepreneurial one in the sense, like he was fundamentally a political entrepreneur. He was always, and I suppose this came from his campaigning background, as a New South Wales Liberal Party state director. He was always looking for something new, some new way in which he could present or frame himself. The ScoMo image was one of them. One point he started talking about can-do capitalism. So it doesn't always work. It was quickly dropped because it didn't have resonance. But he came back from the United States, remember, at one point, and started talking about the evils of, was it globalism or something like that, or negative globalism, I think was his. He was always searching, seeking, marketing, if you like, testing the market. But in the end, it kind of didn't work because of these character flaws. He wasn't able to grapple with the complexities, for instance, of the gender issue. He clearly was doing all sorts of things behind the scenes around secret ministries that didn't affect him that side of the election, but it did eventually. But it seems to me Dutton, and I'll be interested in Lech's view on this, he seems to be a much less creative, a much less entrepreneurial political leader, less nimble, if you like, in the way that he sort of markets himself.
Well, Dutton is he's not someone who's really comfortable in the limelight, whereas I think Morrison thrived on it. He loved the sound of his own voice, and he loved the sight of his face on TV. I don't think, and maybe that's for good reason with Dutton, maybe, but I don't think that Dutton's driving force to be in politics, whether you love him or loathe him, is like some sort of vanity project. Like I think that he kind of genuinely believes in what he's pursuing, and it is about. I actually think that he's a much more reactionary leader than John Howard. John Howard used some very reactionary politics around refugees, but he was fundamentally trying to reshape the country and especially the economy. I think that was his main game in politics, and he used these other issues as a way to do that. Whereas I think Dutton, his starting point in politics was the reactionary politics, and then the economics is kind of like the second order issue. And so I think that the economics that he's attracted to is essentially protecting the economic system that John Howard set up. And so he's very much running like a protection racket for the politics of the Howard era.
One of the minor tragedies of the Morrison era is that the mystery of why Scott Morrison wanted to be Prime Minister may now never be solved.
Well, we know it's because he believed he was Daniel in the lion's den, apparently. At one point he was also Moses with his rod. And he said that my cap, this is a literal thing in the book, my cap is like Moses' rod, he said. It was quite extraordinary stuff. But there was clearly a subplot there that we always suspected.
Can you just fill people in about what Moses' rod was in case they don't know?
Well, the particular rod I'm thinking of was the one that he sort of held up. But anyway, yeah. That's why he wanted to be Prime Minister, apparently. Yeah.
I promise that we won't talk about Scott Morrison's rod any more than we have to.
Or Moses' rod. Yeah.
How much of Morrison's grabbing to these secret ministries was an attempt to create a feeling of gravity and authority that he was unable to as a leader using other means?
I think, and this is a thing that we've been analysing a little bit because of Morrison's book, but I think that there's because I did a essay about the relationship, partly about the relationship between Brian Houston, who was the leader of Hillsong, now disgraced, and Scott Morrison, and the way that those views might filter his approach to issues like climate change if he believes that the world is inevitably going to end very soon. And I think that one of the issues in Australian politics is that we don't really fully analyse our leaders until they're being knocked off their perch. Until everyone can go in and kind of lay into them. It's almost like we let opposition leaders it's not until they're Prime Minister and they're really messing things up that we really kind of draw the curtain back. Whereas I think that if we more rigorously analysed our opposition leaders and held them to a higher standard, but then when you do that, you're there's always, it's a very loaded space now, because there's always the accusation of bias that if you going too hard against a political leader, that you're biased against their political party or their ideology.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with Morrison. I mean, he never really presented, I think, as a strong leader, or at least he wasn't able to pull off that particular performance. Whereas, quite obviously, as Lech shows so well in the book, in the essay, that is kind of the template. For Dutton, Dutton wants to be thought of as a strong leader in that kind of traditional sense, and I think with Morrison, it was a kind of attempt to mix different leadership styles, and he wasn't able to pull any of them off. Sometimes he was a bit hawk-like. He wanted to be a kind of, an everyman who was out there with the masses and identifying with the tastes of the common people, but he couldn't quite pull it off because people didn't quite believe it. And then sometimes, he wanted to be a strong leader, but then, it was pins in strawberries, if you recall, that he was exercising his strength around. That didn't work terribly well. Then he got, the AUKUS thing, that was Morrison as a strong statesman. He mixed them, and in the end, it was never entirely clear why he wanted those ministries, not least because he virtually exercised no power under them. For a while there, I thought there was something strange and megalomaniac about this, but he didn't actually do anything much. I mean, I think there was one decision, wasn't there, around offshore exploration of oil from memory, wasn't it? Or gas, oil? It was here, wasn't it? Yeah. And that was it. There was nothing else. It was very odd. Yeah.
And when he first, if his maiden speech is like one of the great maiden speeches in Australian politics, when you like then trace his career, because he quoted Bono and talked about solving poverty in Africa, and that was his like. And so this is an example of his chameleon nature. Is that 2008, Kevin Rudd is at the height of his kind of popularity, and Morrison's gone, I need to be the liberal Kevin Rudd, and so he kind of presented as this like wonky. Compassionate Christian, like, and then was within how many years was he like the opposition immigration spokesperson and kind of like doing that strongman act very harshly on borders, and then famously had the trophy on his desk in the shape of a boat saying I stopped these. So it was a very quick turnaround from Desmond Tutu and Bono, and then to.
That's right.
Yeah, he does seem to have this kind of market researched or mixtape quality to his leadership, where it's a little bit of everything for everyone, which ends up persuading no one. And that's kind of continued. You know, he's now recast himself as a kind of evangelical Christian leader trying to sell his book and persona in the United States. I think his book, from memory, has sold something like 300 copies since it's been released here. There's not very much appetite for that locally.
On the other hand, he will be performing at Words on the Waves next year. So
whatever else you say about him, is Peter Dutton a conviction politician? Does he believe in what he's doing?
All politicians are like a little bit full of shit. So there's like it's just like the extent to which they're full of shit. But I think that Dutton is different to Morrison in that respect. Like I think that there is like inauthenticity in the way that he talks about the Australian dream and the property market, and he tries to play down the extent of how well he did out of the property market. But at the same time, like if you compare his maiden speech to now, you're like, he has like less hair and he's a bit paunchier, but he's basically the same person. Like he's selling the same message. He tries to smile like a little bit more, but it's not very believable. So I think that he would have, and he's hasn't said this publicly, but he saw Morrison as being a completely inauthentic person. And like a lot of people within the Liberal Party, even those who didn't like Dutton's politics and didn't like some of the issues that he attracted himself to, they were able to recognise that he was a more authentic person in terms of privately than what Morrison was. Morrison was just constantly playing games and saying different things to different people, whereas Dutton is pretty kind of like consistent and sort of just puts his like flag in the mast in like around lots of different issues, and also just in interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, it's sort of the same figure but with glasses on is the difference. Reading Bad Cop, he sort of reminded me a little bit of Colonel Jessup in A Few Good Men. That his argument is that as a policeman, as head of the Department of Home Affairs, I have seen things that you have not, that I must protect you from and take on great powers to do things you are unwilling to do. Is that sort of your sense of him as well?
Yeah, but he's also a mystery in the sense that he ran for state parliament for the Liberal Party at the age of 19 before he joined the police force. So I
wish he'd won.
So he's like, he has like I think that his time in the police force definitely entrenched his social conservatism, especially on matters of race. And I think it explains the deep contempt that he holds for Paul Keating in particular, because a year after he entered the police force, Keating makes the Redfern speech, the Royal Commission into Indigenous Deaths in Custody has been delivered. And so this young Dutton, who is already identifies with conservative politics, is then kind of feels like his whole way of life is under siege from these kind of elites, and then that has just reverberated throughout his career. Like that's this battle between for him, this battle between the kind of like what he sees as the inner city elites and the real Australians is like very real, and he sees himself as a exemplar of like the real Australia, of kind of like mainstream Australia. No matter how little that bears like resemblance to reality.
I mean, one thing I was struck by in reading your work, Lech, is, I mean, it's a relentlessly bleak outlook that he has. I mean, when I think of Morrison, when I think of Howard, even Tony Abbott in some ways, a much more sort of optimistic outlook on the world, whereas in Dutton's, it's this sense of decent, real Australians, if you like, being besieged. They're besieged by pedophiles, they're besieged by crooks and criminals, they're besieged by inner city elites. But it's a relentlessly dark vision of the world that I don't think we can see as mainstream, sort of Liberal Party, because we certainly don't find it with Menzies, their great, hero, but we don't find it with, their modern hero of John Howard either.
No, and it's also a very secular kind of pessimism. It's like, and this I think is a key difference between him and Abbott and Morrison. I think that kind of explains the optimism of Abbott and Morrison. Like Morrison saw himself as kind of like the saviour, and like whereas Dutton also has that saviour complex, but it's not based on some sort of preordained greatness. It's like he actually, unless he's the guy, unless he does the political hard yards, nobody's going to be able to save all these people that he sees as needing to be saved.
Yeah, it's not redemptive at all. No. Frank, mentioning sort of Dutton's hostility to Paul Keating, reading Dreamers and Schemers, we kind of think of John Howard as being the contemporary Prime Minister that other political leaders respond to. But I was really struck by how true that is of Paul Keating in your book. And then in some way, Howard is best understood as a response to Keating or a repudiation of Keating. You talk a bit about sort of the difference between enlargers and other types of Australian leader, and Paul Keating being the ultimate defeated enlarger really comes through in your book very clearly. Yeah,
I mean, I sometimes wonder if Dutton doesn't get some of his political style from Keating, that very aggressive public
he's
style.
Said publicly that he admires, like he hates Keating, but he actually, it's kind of like a love-hate relationship. He kind of admires the way that he just went for the jugular of his opponents, and so it's something that's certainly true of Dutton.
Yeah. Even physically sometimes looks like him to me, if you sort of have to squint a bit, but he does a little bit.
He has used some of Keating's phrases on occasion, hasn't he?
Is that right? Yeah, that's interesting.
Takes him like the basket weavers in Balmain, which is actually a Keating quote.
No, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Keating now stands as kind of the elder statesman, doesn't he? I suppose a bit like Gough Whitlam was when I was a kid, or in fact, not really just a kid, really. He lived so long. And Hawke had a different kind of role as a sort of popular folk hero within the Labor Party, but Keating now does have that kind of elder statesman. That's very important for the modern Labor Party because he opposes them over particularly the key aspect really of their security policy, AUKUS, and you sense that they're very spooked by that this figure who has such authority, who has such symbolic weight within the party, has opposed the mainstream, position of the Albanese government. So I found that very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of bravado around that. Paul Keating doesn't speak for the Labor Party. He's not in the government, all this sort of stuff. But you sense that has been somewhat demoralising within the Labor Party because, I mean, clearly the party is divided over AUKUS, and to have a figure of Keating's authority and weight with people like, others like Bob Carr sitting over on the side saying similar things, I think has been somewhat difficult and probably it's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon.
With that kind of overshadowing effect that past or present leaders can have, I'm curious about the effect of Trump on Australian politics. It's something that's brought up over and over again, and it's a comparison that is made often with people on the right side of politics. In some ways, what's striking is how little influence Trump has really had in Australia, not how much. That our institutions have largely kind of passed the test so far that they are currently failing in the UK and US. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, and I think that like the comparison is sometimes made between Trump and Dutton, and there are like similarities. But Dutton's been doing what he's been doing for a lot longer than Trump existed as a politician. Like he didn't really need any encouragement, and I think that what happened after Trump was elected though was that you saw mainstream parties around the world shit themselves about the defection of voters away from establishment parties, and that was when Dutton really took it to another level. So although I wouldn't say that he's completely needed to copy Trump, I think the election of Trump brought out this race, and it happened with the Labor Party as well. You had Shorten come out after the election of Trump talking about how the Labor Party wouldn't lose their Virginias and like the equivalents, and then you had Pauline Hanson on the front lawn at Parliament House popping champagne and saying like that this is the end of the establishment. So, but I don't see that. I don't see a Trump style figure sweeping Australian politics in the same way. I think that partially because of compulsory voting, partially because I don't know. Like Abbott talks about when he said that the Liberal Party needs to adopt the playbook of the Republicans. He kept on talking about the flyover states, and the flyover state. There's not many flyover states in Australia. There's 2 of them. One of those isn't even a state. It's a territory. It has 2 lower house seats and 2 Senate seats. So like the idea that there's this kind of like great mass of white rural working class. Like I think a lot of that white rural working class is already in the coalition anyway. Like I don't see much of it left with the Labor Party. Like
I mean, I think Trumpism had. I think the combination of Brexit and Trumpism was significant in destroying Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership. You'll remember that Brexit occurred during the 2016 election campaign, and then you had Trump at the end of the year, and I think it emboldened his. It sort of emboldened his opponents within the Liberal Party and the National Party to oppose him. And so I think it mattered in that context. In terms of broader cultural impacts, I mean, I think it is interesting that Australia, not uniquely, I would have thought alongside Canada, alongside New Zealand, did not have the kind of anti-immigrant, basically an anti-immigration populist revolt that clearly was behind Trumpism, that was behind Brexit. And it's worth thinking about why that might be. I mean, all 3 countries are obviously countries of settlement, and all 3 have elevated the idea of a kind of settlement policy that has become a part of their national identity. For Canada and Australia, of course, it's multiculturalism. Australia basically borrowed multiculturalism from Canada. In New Zealand, it's biculturalism. And so, it seems to me that more engineered, self-conscious effort to, if you like, integrate migrants paid dividends at a time when there was a global populist revolt going on. And so I think there were some important distinctions there.
How much of those distinctions economic? I mean, the difference is very extreme in some ways. If you look at the economic performance of the rural United States in response to globalization, it's very poor. That's true of the regional United Kingdom as well. While as here, during that same period, for the first time, blue-collar wages began outstripping graduate wages, partly because tradies were making so much money.
And you look at, like, my dad's family are all from Ipswich, and so I've looked a lot at the history of Ipswich, and Ipswich produced Pauline Hanson, who was married to one of my dad's best mates. That's where she got her last name from before they got divorced. And so, my family history kind of overlaps with that a little bit in the way that you see the deindustrialisation of Ipswich, and then that produces a populist revolt. But then Ipswich, although it has some issues still, it's done remarkably well because it is quite close to Brisbane. You've had influx of other kind of sources of business. The property market there has gone from strength to strength ever since the property market exploded everywhere else. So you haven't had that kind of like same entrenched intergenerational depression. There is like pockets of that, but I think more broadly that Ipswich now is wealthier than what it was like by proportion than than it was in the early 1980s. There's just less of that. There might be less sense of community and kind of that unionised workforce, but it's not comparable to the coal mining settlements across like West Virginia, for example.
And if you want a good book on the US, this US revolt, I can't recommend anything more highly than Richard's work on this, which has been fantastic. You've written with great insight on that revolt, really, and its its meanings at the local level. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't have a good answer for why regional Australia has outperformed the regional United States and United Kingdom to such an extreme degree. I mean, there are many examples of this, but one of them which has really stuck with me is that in the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, former coal mining town, much like Newcastle here, the largest private business is Newcastle United Football Club by a considerable margin. These are places where 20-30% of people might be on disability pensions. They have just never recovered from the removal of heavy industry in a way that is not really true here.
Yeah, I mean, there are pockets of it here. Go to Elizabeth in South Australia, north of Adelaide, and you'll get a sense of that, what a deindustrialised area looks like with high entrenched unemployment. But it's not as widespread a phenomenon as you get in the north of England and some parts of Scotland, particularly north of England. And I know less about the United States, but clearly, those same sorts of things have happened there. One hears of, ex-coal mining communities in West Virginia and all the rest of it, and deindustrialisation in a lot of those states that have become the battlegrounds, haven't they, for presidential elections. So, yeah, I mean, Australia's economy has been relatively robust, and this comes back to some of the stuff I talk about in my book. This, that demand that has been incredibly resilient despite the impacts of neoliberalism, that governments look after people, that governments basically stand in there to protect people from the very worst that an economy can throw at them, has been incredibly powerful and resilient in Australia. And we saw it, during the COVID pandemic. I mean, things like JobKeeper, to a lesser extent JobSeeker, come straight out of that older tradition that it's the role of governments to protect. And, that was a coalition government that did that. And but it doesn't come particularly out of coalition politics. It comes out of a very deeply entrenched political culture.
Pandemics are revealing events. We were talking a little bit about this backstage, and I'm curious what both of you think about what COVID revealed about Australia and what it revealed about our political leaders as well.
I think that it. I can't remember who exactly might have said it, but I wrote a different quarterly essay called "Top Blokes" about larrikinism, and this idea that Australia are all larrikins and that we hate authority is complete bullshit, because I think we saw during the pandemic, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but like we were an incredibly kind of rule-abiding society, and we there was pockets of protest, but generally speaking, I think Australian society organised itself very well in a way that was willing to protect the most vulnerable in our society. So I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but like I think it kind of clashes with our self-image.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, I think that that sense of Australia really deep down being a rather obedient society was very much there, although it's an obedience that demands consent. I mean, politicians can't just ride roughshod over people's views. They could only do that because people were willing to accept it and did give a kind of informal consent. But yeah, the other aspect that really stands out for me is that protective ethic, the fact that governments were willing to spend vast sums of money. I've often said that the fundamental kind of institution of Australian democracy is the commissariat. Now, you probably haven't heard of the commissariat. The commissariat was essentially the store, the government store in early colonial Australia. And the role of the government store was basically to ensure that everyone, convicts, civilian if necessary, was clothed, fed. It was, in fact, operated as a kind of de facto bank. So receipts from the public store were effectively a currency at a time when there wasn't a currency. Australia didn't have a currency at that time. And it just seemed to me that the ethic, if you like, of the commissariat reached right down to pandemic politics, and it was there in all those measures that, again, were designed to provide a kind of floor, a minimum, you know, that would ensure that people didn't fall too far down, that they didn't become destitute. And that to me was a very, I think, powerful exemplar. But it's important to keep in mind that, you know, it's not all positive, because the government store in early colonial Australia, like a lot of these schemes, could be rather, corrupt's perhaps not the word, but let's face it, they were exploited too, weren't they? Businesses that were quite profitable were extracting from JobKeeper and all the rest of it. That's sort of how the government store worked too. You know, it too, you know, didn't necessarily bear examination in terms of its, you know, cleanness or its integrity, but it worked. And I think that pragmatic insistence on what works was very powerful during the pandemic.
It might be a little telling that we are almost at the end of a session about Australian political leadership, and we've barely mentioned the Prime Minister so far.
I think that he would be. I think that's basically his strategy.
Malcolm,
I think you wrote an essay about that, Richard.
yeah. Malcolm Fraser said he wanted
the
to
vanishing man.
The vanishing man.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about this, about how the Labor Party sort of deifies its losers. You know, changing Australian politics is a bit of a suicide mission. If you look at people like Whitlam, like Paul Keating, even like Gillard, they've tended to have very brief careers where they have sort of sacrificed themselves in making a lot of change in a relatively small period of time. And Anthony Albanese seems to be trying to be a more Hawke-like figure, be a more Howard-like figure, be much more moderated, and sometimes looks a little bit lost in that process.
Yeah, and I think that it's to keep harping on about that electoral coalition thing. Like, I'm not sure that the electoral coalition exists to do what Hawke and Keating did. Like, I don't think that you get it's kind of easy to beat up on the Labor Party, but they've tried at various times to do things and they haven't been able to get the public support for them. So I would connect that with the talking about working class voters. Like, the Labor Party, for some of its faults, has done a pretty good job at holding on to working class voters, a lot better than a lot of social democratic parties in Europe, and even the Democrats in America. So yeah, I think it's I think that what that leads to, though, is like a leadership now that is heavily traumatised by past defeats, kind of haunted by the ghosts of various either deposed Labor leaders or Liberal leaders who have beaten them in different elections. And so it means that, and also a media landscape which is hostile towards them. And so it means that there's a fair bit of trepidation in every single word that is uttered by like a Labor politician, especially the Prime Minister.
Among the Labor losers, they don't deify Mark Latham, I think it would be fair to say. But I do take the point. Malcolm Fraser said he wanted to get the politics off the front page, I remember in the mid-70s, and I think Albanese succeeded finally. Malcolm Fraser didn't. But I think in a lot of ways, well, the Hawke-Keating era destroyed the stabilities of those constituencies. I mean, the key, in a lot of ways, the key modern elections, 1990, the Labor Party won. Hawke government was returned with less than 40% of the primary vote, the kind of primary vote that would once have been a landslide against you. You know, that just showed the changes that were going on, and we're still heirs to that. But I think Albanese, in a lot of ways, he was elected like, and to some extent has governed like a state premier. You know, if you think of all those Labor state premiers, they often would fall over the line at an election, sometimes even as a minority government to begin with, and then sometimes they'd managed to carve out, often they'd managed to carve out something better at subsequent elections. It'd be very hard, I think, for Albanese to do that, because it's a much more complex situation to do that nationally. You can see the ways in which, you know, Labor has virtually no seats, or very few seats in Queensland, for instance, so you can't do it in quite the same way as you do at the state level. But, you know, in a lot of ways, it's been very state premier-like, I think. It would be my observation of the ways, his style of government. It's collegial, I think, broadly speaking, or at least it gives the impression of being collegial. We don't really know at this stage how fundamentally collegial it is. But you know, it does seem to me that that model of state politics, where Labor's been very successful electorally,
and when people are voting based on health and education, they generally vote for the Labor Party. But it's the so-called daddy issues like national security and borders where the Liberals are perceived as having a advantage. And so I think Albanese, whether you agree with it or not, Albanese's strategy was essentially to neutralise the national security, and that's why we saw him kind of dive straight into echoing the plans around AUKUS and also adopting basically the same positions on asylum seekers, and then trying to emphasise the differences especially in health. And I think that'll be I don't against Dutton. I think his main attack is going to be on Dutton's record as health minister and the proposed GP co-payment. I think that rather than any of these other kind of social issues where there's probably a lot to criticise Dutton about, I think that Albanese will stay away from them and really focus on health.
We are at a writers' festival, so before we go to questions, there's one more thing I wanted to get the panellists' impression on, and that is to what extent Albanese is a Labor leader who is breaking with the tradition of rhetoric in the Labor Party. We think of Labor Prime Ministers as people who make great visionary speeches. There are several obvious famous examples. It's very hard to think of a rousing speech that Anthony Albanese has made, or even what that speech might look like. Is the bully pulpit empty now?
Yeah, I mean, people said similar things about Hawke, though, in the 80s, that compared to the rousing speeches of a Curtin or a Whitlam, that there was something missing. You couldn't sort of, read them or enjoy them in the same sorts of ways that people had done with those earlier leaders. But I think that's broadly true, and I think it speaks again to his low-key, again, state premier-like. I mean, how many speeches of state premiers do you recall? Not many. Maybe, Neville Rand talking about Balmain boys not crying or something, I don't know. But not many. And I think that that, again, speaks to, the under-the-radar approach that I think has been very important to Albanese's mode of government.
And I don't think I think he probably is self-aware enough that he's not capable of delivering those styles of speeches. And I think in a weird way it could almost be an advantage for him, because one of the risks for Labor leaders is being seen as arrogant, because that they're trying to lecture down to people. And I don't think he conveys any of that. Like he might have that can be a flaw in itself, because he doesn't have the power of persuasion that I think that other Labor leaders have had. But then he also doesn't really emanate arrogance. I don't think he's seen as kind of conceited in the way that, say, Keating was eventually seen.
He could give a big wedding speech, perhaps, in due course.
I think Peter Dutton's already offered to sprinkle the petals down the aisle at his wedding, so that'll be great to watch.
We will go to questions now, if there are any. This gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Labor governments have always suffered under a weight of expectations. Is that changing now, do you think, with the present government? Although they're in danger, I suppose, or they're concerned about losing votes to the Greens on certain traditional issues, perhaps?
I think one of the really interesting things that you mentioned when Hawke was elected, one of the really interesting things whenever I've done research is going back and seeing what the perception of those leaders was before they were elected. And so Hawke was seen as being too cautious, that he wasn't really proposing to do anything. It was very small target. Howard was accused of the same thing, as basically adopting the same positions on health as Keating and trying to minimise the difference between him and the Labor Party. So it's kind of interesting the way that we're kind of seeing it play out in real time, and that the idea is that Albanese's got like a small target. And I guess his argument would be, well, that that Howard was only able to achieve what he ultimately was able to achieve, which was massive wholesale changes, was because he kept on getting elected, and that it didn't all happen in a single electoral cycle. But it remains to be seen where that, like, Howard did go to an election relatively soon, like he went to 98, proposing to make some really big changes. So we're still waiting for Albanese to do something in a similar mode.
Yeah, I mean, and Whitlam government's now recalled as transformative and radical and all the rest of it. but there was a book appeared, about 1974, I think, and the title was From I think Tweedledum to Tweedledee, talking about the Liberals to Labor. So even Whitlam couldn't escape that sense that it had been excessively cautious and had made too many compromises. It's a part, I think, of the reception of Labor governments. Yeah.
Thank you. Most interesting. I get the impression from what the three of you have said that you are not you're not particularly enamoured by the Labour government or Albanese's performance. And I just wonder why it is that you say that, apart from the fact that maybe he doesn't make marvellous speeches, he's just very low-key. And also, what's your view on the likelihood of the Labour Party winning the next election?
Yeah, I don't think I have a particularly negative view of this government. I think, broadly speaking, it's been an effective government. It's, as far as we can see, managed to maintain the kind of electoral coalition that got into office. Certainly if the by-elections have been, the most important of the recent ones being Dunkley, are any indication, it's been successful in that regard, which is very important in terms of seeking re-election. In terms of what it's done, I think it's grappled with a number of problems that had been very pressing and difficult over quite a period of time. It's been occasionally bolder than I expected. I honestly thought they would stick to the tax regime, the income tax regime they'd inherited from the previous government. They didn't, and it's not revolutionary, but it probably was bolder than I expected. So, yeah, look, I think broadly speaking, and a lot of low-key things that I guess don't necessarily register much on people's radar, like I don't know, an example might be, there's been a long-standing problem with New Zealand migration. I mean, it's sort of come back to haunt the government in some ways, but the fact that you had this vast number of New Zealanders in Australia that had no pathway to citizenship. Now, the government grappled with that and basically solved it very quickly. So, even things like that are not going to sort of propel a government to popularity. It's been I think it has been a problem-solving government for the most part, and it deserves some admiration for that.
I think that the whole idea of him being low-key, I think that's like a positive thing. And so I wrote before the 2021 election that there was a lot of people thought that for a Labor leader to be elected from opposition, that they needed to be a transformative leader. And I thought that in this particular case, that wasn't true, because I think that people didn't really want, they wanted kind of steady and low-key. So I think that's kind of been an advantage for Albanese. It's just whether that will be able to facilitate the kind of change, both economic and social, that we've seen with previous leaders. But as I've also said, I'm not sure whether that kind of change is maybe capable in the current electoral conditions. So it's kind of that's not Anthony Albanese's fault. I think that it's broader than that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think in terms of being enamoured of leaders, Labor or otherwise, and any relationship like that with the Labor Party, I think would be a doomed romance. But I tend to think more in terms of institutions, and I sometimes feel like people still haven't really understood what is happening and is about to happen in the United States. That we are looking at the end of democratic legitimacy in institutions. And that is a catastrophic failure which history has shown is almost impossible to get back from. There are very, very few examples of societies getting to this kind of brink and turning back. So Albanese's softly approach is something about I'm thinking about in those terms. Can we have transitions of power that are peaceful, where losers don't try and blow up the whole system on the way out? That's where my mind's at the moment.
I think I've got it now. That was an interesting final comment you made, because there's quite a bit of... Can you hear me? There's a lot of discussion about neo-feudalism, but that wasn't the point I wanted to make. which is that there's no comment, you've made no comment about the influence of mass media, which it seems to me has proliferated in the last few years, unfairly or unfairly, and that the commentary is rapid when a decision is made. Do you have an opinion on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an ongoing problem, or it's probably a little bit out of date now, where journalists used to insist that politicians be authentic and then punish them when they were. The concept of a gaffe is someone accidentally saying something that's true, and then journalists trying to extract a concession from them that was a mistake. I think that is less cutting than it was in the pre-social media era. We were talking a little bit about the influence of mass media being not quite what it was. It doesn't quite have the king-making role that The Sun did in the United Kingdom, for example. Bill Shorten was someone who didn't quite court Rupert Murdoch in the way that past later leaders had. But we can see from the Laura Tingle example that they can still make people dance when they want to. So I think that kind of grading has changed from making the Prime Minister apologise to making the Managing Director of the ABC apologise. It's a different weight class, but it's the same action.
Yeah, I think that the power of News Corp, for example, is actually more profound over institutions like the ABC and also over the Labor Party than what it is over the general population. I think that it's been like a very long-term ideological warfare over decades to basically paralyse both of those organisations through the fear of day after day of front page stories demonising certain figures and accusing them of ideological bias or left-wing bias. And yeah, I think that we've gotten to the point now where we see at a state level that even in Queensland, which is Brisbane only has one newspaper, daily newspaper printed, which is the Courier Mail, and yet Anastasia Palaszczuk was able to get re-elected multiple times, and she was a childless, unmarried woman. So the idea that these social conservative ideals imposed by News Corp will decide elections, I think is kind of like we've moved past that point. But I don't think that the party, the Labor Party itself, has kind of reconciled itself with the growing irrelevancy of News Corp.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable that we're in a situation where Rebecca Brooks is in town, the architect of the phone hacking scandal.
Check your phones. Yeah.
And at the same time, the organisation that she is restructuring can lecture people like Laura Tingle about rhetoric and morality, and it seems that nobody is capable of telling them to go fuck themselves.
Why don't I see you on Insiders?
You think that's going to happen on Insiders?
I mean, Insiders is kind of a really good example of legacy media, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how many people are watching Insiders these days. But, it does seem to me it's a very old genre. The genre of journalists interviewing journalists goes back a long, long time. And I just wonder whether that kind of exercise is really having the kinds of impacts that it might have 30 or 40 years ago, or even maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when it was kind of agenda setting for the week, certainly for the Sunday, but often for the week, when, you had Laurie Oakes on, what was it, Sunday it was called, wasn't it? That sort of exercise. I'm really with Lech on this. I don't think that's happening anymore. A lot of the influences here are on the political class, and they need to be weaned off it. They are, I think, being weaned off it to some extent. I mean, it's very interesting listening to a very senior Victorian Labor Party strategist 18 months, 2 years ago, whatever it was, probably 18 months ago. And they pay very little attention now to the traditional newspapers in terms of their election strategies, because they honestly don't think they matter terribly much. Yeah.
There's a US media analyst called Jay Rosen who was in Australia and made some very interesting comments about Insiders. He said that he was very disturbed by the name Insiders, which when you think about it is very strange. These are people who are supposed to be representative. Journalists are not supposed to be insiders in that sense. And this kind of like horse race journalism where they're talking about how something plays. Well, they're talking to the people that it is intended to play, as though that's a normal activity and should be fine, and they're not always there as representatives of their readership. And you can tell a lot of the time that journalists are writing for a readership of a small number of politicians, not for the people who are reading them as a news source. You know, it's about, what a drop is for, you know, the intended...
It's about maintaining access rather than actually pursuing the truth.
Yeah. And as the power of the media to influence an audience dwindles, you would expect to see more of that as well, not less.
Thank you. Do you think the government's doing enough on climate change to avoid a splintering of their vote to the Teals or to the Greens at the future elections? And if they did more, would the vote splinter in different ways?
Well, the more important thing is, are they doing enough on climate change to help save the planet, of course? But yeah, I mean, they remain spooked by, I mean, Lech knows much more about this than I do, but they clearly remain very spooked by the 2019 election and what was done with coal as an issue at that election. I mean, you've written on this much more extensively than anything I've said.
Yeah, and I think that, but one of the things that the last election showed was that the Labor Party was able to get a majority without actually winning any, and I'm from Queensland, so I'm kind of like biased towards Queensland, but they were able to win a majority without getting any seats in Queensland. So I think that the strategy that they need to neutralise Queensland is maybe wrong-headed, and it's potentially going to lead to the loss of metropolitan seats in Sydney and Melbourne to the Greens or to Teal-type independents. So I think that is like a massive fault line for the Labor Party, and that it could have a really negative backlash against them unless they demonstrate like a real commitment to the reduction of emissions.
Thank you to Frank and Lech, and thank you for being such a fabulous and engaged audience. I enjoyed this. I hope you did too. And we hope to see you afterwards. Thank you.